Get ready for a wild one. So this is you're meant to understand that this is a good story. Arthur's dad is waging a war, and simultaneously he falls in love with the wife of the guy that he's waging the war on.
Is this Uther Pendragon?
Yes.
Yes.
Merlin then magics a glamour on Uther Pendragon so that he looks like the guy whose war he's fighting, and then he goes and shags his wife. Bada bing, bada boom, that's your Arthur.
Eleanor, welcome to After Dark.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk about magic.
We have been speaking about different topics with Eleanor today already, but now we are coming to King Arthur. So, yes. Eleanor, tell us a little bit about what we can expect from this episode before we get into the nuts and bolts.
I think the number one thing that people are going to get out of this is that King Arthur is in many ways a choose your own adventure. Mm-hmm. And it is, an entire genre. It's not just like, oh, there's King Arthur and here's his story, because well, what does that mean? Because, King Arthur from, stories that we have that sort of survive from 6th century Wales is very different to King Arthur as he shows up in 15th century French stories, and it's different again to, the King Arthur stories that we tell as well now. So there is a kind of rotating cast of characters, and the way that I say you kind of need to think about Arthuriana is it's kind of like the MCU or something like that, where it's like, here's another hero who comes in and he's got his standalone stories over there, and there are constant reboots.
Yeah. It's an extended universe and all of it is canon. Mm-hmm. It's just added to constantly, right?
Yeah, it's a very ongoing process of yes and.
Okay.
Yeah. Where, and you might not like one particular part of something, so you strip it out, you can put another one in, and, people will just start over and over and over again. And I think a thing that's also really quite interesting about it is we tend to think of it as this sort of quintessentially British form of literature, but actually people in Germany are writing about this, people in France are writing about this, so everyone's kind of getting involved. It isn't like very specific to one region or place.
See, that's very interesting to me, because I would think of Arthur and his knights as being quite English and tied to ideas of national identity, sometimes for worse as well as better, and that he kind of shapeshifts according to the times that he's needed in. But it's interesting that he has this kind of broader geographical reach.
Isn't he Welsh?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there we go. Isn't that interesting, though, that's my perspective on it? Yeah. That he does shapeshift for different people.
Yeah, and you're bang on here, because it's like, so our very, very, very first Arthur stories come from Wales, and they come from the 6th century, and we imagine that there must have been some kind of oral tradition that we are not exactly privy to. And the versions of these things that we have in manuscript form, they show up, a few hundred years even after that. And the original King Arthur stories are so funny in comparison to the really rich literature that we have later in the medieval period, or, when the Victorians get their hands on it again, because they're like so sparse, where they're like, my name is Arthur and I'm here to say I like hunting boar in a normal way, and then that's basically
Sorry, did you come up with that right now?
Yes, I did, which is kind of really sad.
Oh my God.
The rest of this episode will just be Eleanor doing that.
Well, history raps.
But that's what they are. They're all rhymes, right?
Yes,
and they're usually like, Arthur kind of shows up the first times as like a certain king's cousin or something like that. And they're like, oh yeah, I went over to my cousin Arthur's place, and there he is. And
so he's not the main character to begin with.
No.
But we know him now as the main character and a sort of ensemble cast around him.
Yeah.
So can we just establish some of those other characters? So we've got Arthur. Eventually, at what point does he become the main character?
He fairly quickly. So, at first he's somebody's cousin, and then people say, oh, well, this is a cool guy to go with. We'll go with Arthur. Yeah, sure, fine. Then we have some that people might not have heard of kind of earlier on. So you get Bedivere. Kind of shows up around from about the 10th century or so. Bedivere.
Okay.
And he first shows up to take Excalibur and give Excalibur to the lady in the lake.
That's pretty formative in terms of the legend.
Yeah. Mordred.
Yes, heard of Mordred.
Yeah, we know Mordred, and he's like one of the very, very earliest. He shows up in a historical work, the Annals Cambriae, in about 970 or so. Arthur's bastard son Morgause shows up
heard of Morgause.
pretty early on. Yeah, it's like, so Morgause it's an interesting one because like the fact that Arthur has a bastard son comes in pretty early on. The fact that like he is eventually going to help cause the fall of Camelot, that comes in a lot later. Gawain,
Yes.
you know, your friend and mine, he kind of shows up around for the first time in the 11th century, and that's in Cuckwick and Olwen. And like Olwen or Owen, like he shows up at the same time then. Then there's Eric from Eric and Enid. Eric. It's like, what's Eric doing here?
Jim.
Yeah, right? It's like, I love it that there's like a guy called Eric. Because it's all like Tristan and Bedivere. Eric. Your boy Eric. You know him. And that's one of the earliest poems, and it's really interesting because it's a long meditation on whether or not you should love your wife, which is very funny because they're like, this guy got married and he's having a nice time with his wife and he doesn't adventure anymore. That's not right. I know that's not right.
But interesting though, right? Because we're talking about relationships between men there,
Yes.
and how their relationships with women can be cause a tension in those kind of
because that's central to
homosocial
Arthurian story, right? That Guinevere, the queen, it becomes a problem. Answer me this, just going through some of the names there. Mordred, Morgause, we've got Morgana as well, who we'll get onto maybe. Why are all the baddies in Arthurian legends, as someone whose name begins with an M, why are they all M letters? Is this some kind of medieval linguistic
That's the most specific
thing?
question I've ever heard.
It's always bothered me.
So one of the things that I will say here is we need to step back because, you know, Morgana or Morgan, and sometimes Morgan le Fay, sometimes she's a baddie and sometimes she's a goodie.
Okay, I take it back.
Totally.
Yeah, because like she, like I mean, she is, for me, like it's all about. I want to see like the Morgan extended universe because she's really smart. She kind of gets things done. She is a lot of times a protector. So, for example, by the time we get to the big stories about the fall of Camelot and everything, she's the one who kind of saves Arthur. So, you know, Arthur is wounded, but we never see Arthur die. And she takes Arthur to the Isle of Avalon.
Right.
And like that's where he is. You know,
the mystical.
And so sometimes she's good and sometimes she's bad, but that happens with like a lot of the women characters.
I mean, we see this in long-running TV shows, right? Where after a while, the characters have to change their characterization because the plot isn't moving forward.
Well, exactly. And, you know, we see this in general with the men as well sometimes too. So if you look at the really super early Welsh Arthurian legends, one of the guys that shows up all the time is Kay or Kai or Key. You know, it's the same guy, different ways of saying it. And he initially is like, that's Arthur's bestie, and he's like the greatest guy, and he's like, and you know, oh, we're just hanging out. By the time you get to the later medieval things, he's an antagonist. He's a bad guy. He like is making fun of Percival for no particular reason.
Percival.
Yeah, I know, like Percival, the nerd one. You know, and
Poor Percival.
And poor Percival. You know,
That would have been me.
And you know, you've got Lancelot, who initially went. So first of all, you've got like Kay is really, really good, and then you have Gawain is really, really good, and everyone goes, "Oh, Gawain's the best knight. He's like he's the number one."
Gawain of Green Knight fame.
Yeah. You know, Dev Patel in my head, always.
Dev Patel's in everyone's head all the time, right? Is that not
know,
just me?
yeah.
Taking a turn.
just one moment for Dev. Call me. So
Dev, if you want to come on the podcast at any point.
You have Gawain then become like the superhero knight, like the Superman version of things. Then that gets handed over to Lancelot, and suddenly Lancelot's the best knight. But then when you get into the kind of more romantic poems, so, you know, like Lancelot gets his own kind of series, like Lancelot and the Knight of the Cart and things like this. And this is when he falls in love with Guinevere, and suddenly he's shagging the boss's wife. And then it's like, oh, now there's this new moral tension, which always happens with medieval romance literature, and more specifically medieval courtly love literature, has this tension, right?
Okay.
And so what we mean by romance literature or courtly love literature is that it is a genre of literature that is specifically about hooking up with married ladies.
Yes, and it's a sort of moral test for the men, right? That it's part of their quest.
Yeah, and it's like partially what you're supposed to be doing is you're supposed to be spurred to greatness by these women that you're in love with, and then question mark, you know, like you're supposed to gain their love, and there's an understanding that's fine because, you know, who gets married for love? Nobody gets married for love, which is part of like one of the tensions in Eric and Enid. Because they're like, oh, what, this guy loves his wife. Like that's weird. Like that seems strange. And sometimes the Knights of the Round Table do marry for love, and that's all very nice. But for the most part, it's reflecting a reality for rich people at court, which is that you marry for business reasons, and you marry because that's who you got told you're going to get married to. Then you kind of like sit around all day in court with a bunch of other fancy rich people with time on your hands, and you go, hey, what? Hey, at each other. And you write poems, and they fall in love, and there's all kinds of scandals. So we have a very cool book about this, which is called De Amore by Andreas Capellanus, sometimes also called The Art of Courtly Love. And it's all about how you should, like 2/3, maybe no, 80% of this book is all about how this is how you seduce married women. And like, here you go. Wow. And how like being married is no excuse for not like having extramarital affairs, blah, 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 blah. And the last 10 pages are like, psych, I just told you how to pick up on married ladies so you wouldn't do it. Be a good Christian. And that's kind of what's going on with Arthuriana as well.
Mm-hmm. There's a bit of titillation, and then bam, the moral, don't do it.
So it's like the whole time you're kind of supposed to be going, go Lancelot, go Guinevere, you're in love, shag, shag, shag. But then they do shag, and then they're like, oh, now you can't find the Holy Grail. Mm-hmm. Because only the pure of heart can find the Holy Grail. And then enter Percival. Percival is then introduced. He's Lancelot's bastard son. Sometimes, like sometimes not. They all have different origin stories.
Whoever you need him to be at whatever time.
Yeah.
And it's like a telenovela. Like we've forgotten who is related to who at this point. Like it's
Yeah, and so like basically like then you have Percival get introduced, and Percival is very pure of heart, and he does everything right, and he's able to discover the Holy Grail.
Oh.
And then he eventually ends up ascending bodily into heaven. Like it's very
cash.
Yeah, but it's also funny because like even the Holy Grail changes and what it is. So initially they're like, oh yeah, the Holy Grail, and you're like, what's that? And they're like, I don't know, man. And it's kind of like it's like the Philosopher's Stone or something. It's something that can treat like aging or illness.
So it has magical properties.
Yeah. And then later on, it becomes clear that it's, like the cup that was used at the Last Supper. But this is something that gets added in way, way later. And now we take that for granted. When, if we say Holy Grail, we're all imagining a cup.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But for them, even just these objects change all the time. When you're talking about Welsh King Arthur, his court is just like somewhere, like Camelot doesn't get introduced for hundreds of years, like as a concept.
Yeah.
So these things change all the time, and the meanings change. But what is one of the things that we have to keep in mind of all of this that's quite interesting, because especially when we know that these things go back to kind of the 6th century, is when we're talking about Arthuriana in the Middle Ages, they're like, this is a story from the past. These are long ago and far away stories. They're not contemporaneous. I know when we think of them now, we tend to go, oh, here's some medieval people. These guys are like, King Arthur lived, and there are histories about this. So we have Geoffrey of Monmouth, this is like the boy who kind of invents a lot of Arthur stuff. Because he writes this book called the Historia Regum Britanniae. So,
Catchy.
Yeah, very good. So it's like it's supposedly a history of Britain, and he's the first guy who's like, and Arthur was real, and he lived then, right? And he fixes this as a kind of time after the Romans have left Britain, but before the Saxons show up.
I'm thinking of the Clive Owen film with Keira Knightley here.
Yeah, there you go.
Obviously, entirely
clearly.
Historically accurate.
Duh. Yeah. So it's like the idea is that they're kind of living in. There's this idea of a kind of like nebulous Britishness. So sometimes it's Welsh, sometimes it's English, sometimes it's British, but it's before Saxons come over and introduce whatever is going on there. It's after Romans have left. So
it's an idea of going back to a Britishness that's very vague and woolly, and we can't, it's hidden in the mists of time, but it's outside of the empires or the sort of the invasions of these different forces, whether it's the Romans or the Anglo-Saxons. Or
exactly. Whatever, yeah. So with this, you then also are meant to understand that Arthur is Christian. So one of the things is these guys have kept the Christianity after the Romans have evacuated, and they are set up in opposition to the Saxons, who are still understood as being pagan.
Okay.
So it's also kind of like a call out to like, oh yes, and British people are very, Christian or whatever. So this is kind of happening in the mists of time. And then, so when English or Welsh people are writing about this is about like an understanding of their own nationality, right? When French people and German people get into it, and they do get into it, they're like, for them, it's like, it's the Wild West. Pew, pew. You know, they're like, oh yeah, what's going on up in England? Like, it's the edge of the world.
It's chaos.
It's chaos up there. Like, it's crazy. They got, I don't know, man, story about a dragon under a hill. There's a lady in the lake. He shagged his half-sister. You know, like things like this.
Yeah.
So it's, for them, it is like the edge of civilization, the edge of the Christian world. Who even knows what's happening in Britain? Are they people? I don't know. So you can tell these stories.
Would it be fair to say that some of the elements that we find in these stories, so I'm thinking about things like the lady in the lake or the dragon under a mountain, you know, these things about monsters on the periphery, and obviously you see it as well in Anglo-Saxon poetry with Beowulf and stuff. It's not exclusive to Arthurian legend, but if there's something about how people are understanding their landscape and telling those histories in those terms, but also I'm thinking about these magical objects, the Holy Grail, Excalibur, the sword. I'm sure there's lots of other, I'm thinking the Green Knight's like head and things, you know, there's these kind of magical objects in a world when people are writing these stories down. Material objects are really worth a lot. You know, it's not every day you come across a well-made sword, for example. You know, weaponry is really important. It's really meaningful. Only certain people have access to like really high quality weapons and things. Is there something there that we can extract from these myths about how people understood the material world, the landscape, their world around them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So one of the big things that you see often with Arthuriana in general is that big, magical, huge adventures take place in the woods. And
just the woods.
The woods. You know, the woods that are over there. And the woods for medieval people are really a fraught kind of place. And you've got to understand that for medieval people as well, you know, the relationship with nature is quite different. You know, it's a bit more antagonistic. You know, there is this kind of thing about we really need to tame it in order to make sure that we can just get enough food to eat, right?
Yeah.
And so woods are experienced as this place that is inhuman, right? Because it is wild and it isn't a place that you can necessarily be making crops or things like that. And it's also experienced as very expressly, vaguely magical. So, you know, there are lots of worries in general with folk culture about there being monsters in the wood, about, you know, wizards being in the woods or people who can practice magic and they don't need to participate in society. So they can just kind of go out into the woods and like do their thing. Right. There is this real worry about, you know, just even things like wolves, a lot more scary for them, you know, things like that. There's also the tension there where a lot of the time when there are woods too, they're kind of like owned by the crown and you're not supposed to be in there because there's this kind of like worry about poaching.
Yeah. And they're a place that maybe outlaws can escape to as well, right? I'm thinking later on of like Robin Hood, you know, obviously has presumably older roots, pun intended.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you're bang on there too, which is also something about weaponry. Because there is a real worry about travel and these places where you don't have anyone kind of looking at things. You know, there's no such thing as police in the medieval period. There's no such thing as, you know, a law and order that isn't brought about by kind of lords. You know, there is this common consent of communities that they, you know, everybody wants to get along. But if you are on a road or going through a woods, who knows what's in there? Who's in there and what are they going to do? And so this is a lot like weaponry because weapons are really tightly controlled in the medieval period. You can't just like go around having a sword if you are a commoner. Swords are a very specific shout out to the fact that you are noble, you are kind of like a knight or higher, you're allowed to have a sword because, you know, they're dangerous weapons and, you know, there is a very express idea of who gets to wield violence, and that's the nobility, right? They get to do violence. Now, on the other hand, you are allowed to have a sword if you're a common person and you're traveling.
Oh, okay,
like the one time that you can do it is
because
they're like, oh, it is dangerous out there, right?
Yeah.
But so you usually have to then kind of like leave it when you get to a town or something like that, and they'll kind of like hold it at the guardhouse or something like that, and then you can take hold of it again. Most people still can't afford it.
Yeah.
Most people are going to have like a pike or a knife or something like that.
Yeah.
So, you know, all of this stuff about swords being magical,
Yes.
we have to understand, you know, like, so the sword in the stone or Excalibur, the Lady of the Lake, gives to Arthur as these signs that he is the king. This is also about like, well, who gets to have a sword, right? So there's the magical aspect of it, but it's also just like, well, yeah, and he's got a sword, so you know, there you go. You know, there's our boy, and that's how you know he's king because he's got like an even better sword.
Yeah, the sword.
So speaking of swords then, for anybody who maybe has heard of King Arthur but is not necessarily aware of some of the stories, can you give us some of the details of the Sword in the Stone? That's probably one of the more famous ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Sword of the Stone is a fun one because it introduces a lot of the characters that we've talked to, but then also your friend and mine, Merlin. Merlin is largely invented by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who I've already talked about before, kind of in the 12th century. And he says that Merlin is a wizard, and more specifically, Merlin exists because a demon shagged his mother, and Merlin was going to maybe be a kind of antichrist figure.
It's a classic origin story, isn't it? For I'm thinking in Greek mythology, this idea of like a god coming down, or in this case, a demon, and having sex with a mortal woman and creating a sort of hybrid person. And indeed, we see it in Christianity.
Exactly. And so this is what you kind of get. That's how you get a Merlin. That's how you get someone who can wield magic, because magic is. It's a dicey area, right? It is kind of seen as somewhat suspect because you're attempting to like reorder God's universe, right? So, he can wield magic because his dad's a demon. He was going to maybe be an antichrist kind of figure. He was going to maybe kind of bring about the destruction of the world, but then his mom names him Merlin after her father, and then it humanizes him. So Merlin is made very human, and then he uses his powers for good. And one of the things that he uses his powers to do is kind of help out a young King Arthur. And more specifically, Arthur's dad's. Okay, get ready for a wild one. So this is you're meant to understand that this is a good story, but Arthur's dad is waging a war. And simultaneously, he falls in love with the wife of the guy that he's waging the war on.
Is this Uther Pendragon?
Yes. So Merlin then magics a glamour on Uther Pendragon so that he looks like the guy whose war he's fighting, and then he goes and shags his wife. So
Issues of consent there, I would say.
It's huge in the medieval world.
Yeah, I don't think it's great. I personally would call it not good. So anyway, and then bada bing, bada boom, that's your Arthur.
Are there issues in Arthurian lore then around the fact that Arthur is potentially, arguably, a product of rape? Is that an issue in his stories, or does that not come up?
No, this is played as romance.
Interesting.
Yeah, oh, it's interesting. Yeah. It's like, oh, it's not like, isn't it great? And this happens over and over in varying Arthuriana stories. It'll be like you kill someone's husband and then you show up and then like she shags you and then she's like, oh, I guess I got to marry you now and you killed my husband. That there are all these like really dicey relationships that happen all the time with this. So Arthur's kind of like growing up kind of as a bastard, as like a few down the line. And here's where Kay comes into it as well. So Kay is often his older brother, but like his half brother, right? Because he's half a bastard or whatever. Kay is supposed to be preparing for a big tournament, but there is this sword in an anvil on a stone in a churchyard, and everybody knows that like if you draw that sword out, which is Excalibur, there's like 3 Excaliburs, just so you know, that you become then the King of England. And Merlin has kind of made that sword show up. And then Arthur is supposed to be going and getting Kay's sword because Kay forgot it back at the castle for this tournament. And he kind of goes by and goes, oh, well, I'll just get that one. And then it goes, pring, out comes the sword really quickly. And then he's like, oh, actually, this probably won't do, puts it back in, and then goes and gets the sword. And partially Merlin is like, you got to put it back because everyone needs to see that you've taken that out. And then Merlin has him take it out, and then everyone realizes that Arthur is meant to be the king. So it's a really interesting one because he is kind of like this deus ex machina that is kind of setting everything up for Arthur to come into being and then to also be the king. But there's also this story of Excalibur. It's so confusing because there's so many stories, right? Like it's a very much, which one do you want? It's choose your own adventure. Do you want the Sword in the Stone, or do you want the version where the Lady of the Lake gives Arthur Excalibur? And the Lady of the Lake is one of these, again, really difficult characters because sometimes she's Lancelot's foster mother. Sometimes she's like Merlin's girlfriend. Sometimes she's Merlin's persecutor. Sometimes she's just like, someone who gives you a sword and gives you the thumbs up and leaves again. So she's got these really differing parts to play, right? And this is an interesting thing about Merlin more generally, is that Merlin has these really difficult and very sexual relationships with women that come up over and over again. So, for example, some versions of stories will say that he's in love with Morgan. He is, and one of the reasons that Morgan becomes a really talented enchantress is that Merlin teaches her a lot of things. But there's also this kind of like push and pull there where Merlin will teach women magic if they have sex with him.
Okay, not ideal.
Yeah, not ideal. It's like it's very, very bad. And some of the stories about the Lady in the Lake and Merlin are kind of that Merlin has had this relationship with several women who he has taught, but he never teaches them everything, and he has sex with them. And then he falls in love with the Lady of the Lake, and she says, all right, well, I want to learn things, but I do not put out until you teach me every single thing that you know. And he says, okay, teaches her every single thing that he knows. And then as a result, she's able to use that magic. So I've got a good quote from one of the stories about this, which says, "The damsel was very wise for such a young woman. She perceived very well that he loved her. She was terrified by it, because she feared he would dishonor her by enchantment, or he would make love to her while she was asleep. When she heard that he would accompany her, she was very sorry about it, because there was nothing she hated so much as she did him. And there was nothing in the world that she hated as much as Merlin, for she knew quite well that he wanted to rob her of her virginity." So it's this tension that gets set up with women, right? Where here are women who want to know things. They want to kind of like climb a ladder of knowledge, but they understand that the kind of price for admission is that they've got to sleep with this guy that they don't care about.
Well, there are two separate economies going on in Arthurian lore, aren't there? For the men, there's violence, there's weaponry, there's questing, there's monsters, there's all of that. And the throne and, fighting for that. And for women, it's an economy of... It's a sort of exchange of knowledge and sex, and those are the only things open to them. Do they ever get involved in any of the violence and the questing, or are they kind of trapped in that cycle? That's the only thing available.
I mean, they are pretty trapped. I would say so. I'm kind of like thinking of all of the women, and like, the women often are the cause of various quests. Like in Tristan and Isolde, it'll be things like, Isolde is a really talented healer, but she's married off to, someone else entirely, and it's like her husband, like the guy she loves gets poisoned and like is going to get brought to her, but then like his new wife stops it from happening, and he ends up dying. There are all these terrible things that happen to these women. And indeed, like what is happening with the Lady of the Lake, there's also this really kind of gross internalized misogyny that happens where a lot of the other magic women hate the Lady of the Lake, because sometimes she manages to get all of Merlin's knowledge without having slept with him, and they all had to. And they all really resent that she got more knowledge and didn't also kind of like give up didn't give up this part of themselves. And what the Lady of the Lake then manages to do is cast a spell on Merlin. It depends. Sometimes she just like casts an enchantment spell on him so he falls asleep. Sometimes she magics him inside a tree. But one way or another, he, like King Arthur, is kind of waiting until someday, while he's trapped within these things. So it is the one time when a woman kind of wins something. But it's quite expressly understood to be bad.
I want talking of extended universes, I want a feminist retelling of Arthurian
legend.
legend.
Oh, it'd be good. Yeah,
there must
that
be.
Is,
there
if you
must
Google
be.
that right now, I guarantee you. I mean,
Someone's out there doing the good work.
That's totally there. Let's finish then on one of the foremost, most famous women from Arthurian legend, that being Guinevere. What can you tell us about? Because my understanding of Guinevere is that it can be quite a complex representation of womanhood, in that you get this love, sometimes love-lorn, this sometimes someone who's not very faithful, depending on the stories that you're reading. But also, she can be quite active and she can assert some agency, again, depending on what you're reading. So tell us, color in Guinevere's world for us a little bit. Yeah,
so Guinevere is a really interesting one because, she is, the queen of Camelot. She's King Arthur's queen, but also her love story is her love story with Lancelot.
Yeah.
You know, and that is understood to be kind of naughty but fine. You know, where it's like everybody knows that this is going to cause problems. Everyone knows that they kind of got to keep it down and keep it a secret. But it's also understood as almost an inevitability. You know, Lancelot is really handsome. You know, he is the best knight. He is all of these things. And Arthur is like much her senior. It's just like kind of not, it makes sense within this. But you also have all of this foreshadowing. Right. So one of my favorite pieces of Arthuriana, it's from a poem called The Antwers of Arthur. And in it, Guinevere runs into the ghost of her mother in a forest. So it's a classic Christmas story. It happens at Christmas. There's like a big hunt, and Gawain is bringing Guinevere home. And they run into this absolutely terrible apparition, which it goes like this. It says that all bare was the body, black was the bone, enwrapped in a clout for clothing ill-clad. It mourned and lamented as women make moan. Of skin nor of color nor covering it had. It stayed itself standing still as a stone. It groaned and it glared and it made as on mad. On her cheek, bare and dry, a toad might ye spy. All hollow her eye as embers glow bright. As embers red glowing, the ghost as it glide was wrapped in a clout, in clothing drear. She set over with serpents that clung to its sides, to tell of the toads were a tale full of fear. Quoth Gaynor, which is another name for Guinevere, now say what from dole may thee light. Holy men of the city all seek for thy sake, for those beasts also baleful, thy body that bite, and thy blood turn to blackness, mine eyes blind they make. And the ghost says, nay, these were my lovers, erstwhile my delight, but now have they brought me thus low in this lake. All the wealth of this world it hath now taken flight, while these worms so wretched my torment they take. Thus to wrath am I wrought, my sweet Waynor. I wish mass 900 done. Okay, so this is a classic medieval ghost story. Her mother used to be beautiful, and now her mother's ugly. Her mother used to wear a beautiful, rich garments, and now she's just got like a gross cloth all around her. Her mother used to shag a bunch of men at court, and now they are snakes and toads that are all over her body who are like sucking her blood out of her. So this is a kind of warning about all of the excesses of femininity at court. Like, oh, you think that you're beautiful and you take pride in that, you're going to be ugly. You're going to be ugly in death. You know, you like shagging guys, oh, well, they're going to torment you in hell. And she shows up both as a warning to Guinevere to be like, change your ways. Do not become like me. Don't go around shagging Lancelot. Yeah, you're pretty. Who cares? But also to beg to have 900 masses said for her soul, because the only mediation for ghosts within the medieval period in literature like this is that you've got to go to the church and have a bunch of things said. So it's really interesting because you're shown exactly what the consequences for Guinevere are, but she almost can't do anything about it. It's like this is set in stone. This is the road that you're going down, and it is the one that's inevitable for courtly love damsels, right? And so it's really tragic, because you kind of see that, yeah, there's some idea of personal choice there, but like really what is it, you know?
Yeah, when we think about the Arthurian knights, okay, they all fit into a template of, seeking particular things, and we know there'll be like a moral conclusion, but there's so few options for the women in these stories.
I mean, it's so funny because what I took from that was, wow, Guinevere's mother had a great life.
I know, right?
Queen. It's like good for her, because the skeleton thing didn't happen. But her life did.
Yeah.
And, well, did it. But, in this story. And so, good for her.
Yeah.
Who cares about the skeleton afterwards? That's made up to scare Guinevere. But, like,
yeah.
But what is all of this telling us then? All this made up things based on some facts. It's just such this big mishmash of fact and fiction. Myth, basically. What is it trying to tell us about British history?
Well, in the first place, it's trying to tell us that there are mythical spirits that kind of guard Britain, right? So there's this idea that Arthur is going to kind of come back. He's at Avalon, he's sleeping, and, in Britain's hour of greatest need, he's going to come back. And there's an old legend that says that the Welsh believe this. So, for example, some Anglo-Normans wrote about this in the description of England, and they say that the Welsh say that they openly go about saying that in the end, they will have it all by means of Arthur. They will have it all back, and they will call it Britain again.
I'm just Henry VII, firstborn male, Prince Arthur, doesn't make it to the throne. But with all of that in the background, what is Henry VII saying that this Tudor dynasty, the Welsh Tudor dynasty, is about to take Britain back, bring this glory?
100%. And he does that on purpose. You know, when he comes over to England, he brings a big red dragon flag, which is supposed to show, you know, the dragon of Britain is kind of taking over again. So it's playing on these ideas about destiny and truth and provenance. Now, very interestingly, we don't actually have any Welsh sources that say they believe that, but we just have a bunch of like Normans being like, oh, they totally believe this, and then that becomes eventually transmogrified, especially by Henry VII, into no, this is about England now, or this is about like England leading Britain. So this is a real kind of desire to say that there is magic that is alive in Britain, and that might be on the part of British people who want to big up Britain, and it might be on the part of like French and German people who are like, they're weird up there. What are they like, I think
the idea of magic dormant in Britain is a good place to end, and we'll never know if we may know. Arthur may come back in our lifetimes. We'll see.
Don't schedule anything around that, though.
Yeah. I'm leaving my calendar open just in case. Eleanor, thank you so much for delving into some of the Arthurian lore, and I think there's so much still to discuss, and I'm sure we could do many more hours on this, but that's a really nice taste of some of that world.